So I did my project on the smallpox outbreak of 1972. So smallpox is caused by the variola virus and is in the genus orthopoxvirus. It presents as either variola major or variola minor, depending on the severity of the infection. The incubation period for smallpox is anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks, and flu-like symptoms of infection typically show up 12 to 14 days after exposure. The flu-like symptoms include fever, muscle aches, headache, severe fatigue, back pain, and vomiting. Smallpox characteristic red flat spots don't show up until a few days later and will spread to all parts of the body. Later, these spots will turn into pustules, bursting and scabbing over until they form deep pitted scars and the individual is no longer infectious. Smallpox is transmitted via aerosols as well as through contaminated clothing and bedding and can remain infectious for months when dried on surfaces. There are 5 main types of the variola virus within the 2 infection types, variola major and variola minor. The hemorrhagic type, the flat type within variola major, and the ordinary type, modified type, and the type without exanthemas within variola minor. All types except for the variola minor without exanthema present with pustule-type lesions all over the body. So the outbreak of 1972 smallpox was the largest in European history after World War II and is believed to have begun in Afghanistan, after which it spread to Iran, Iraq, and the Syrian Arab Republic, as well as Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Kosovo. Sporadic cases were reported to the WHO from 1970 through February 1972. Despite a federal recommendation to suspend travel into the countries of Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq, 2,700 religious pilgrims visited Muslim holy sites throughout the Middle East by bus, bringing gifts back from their trip as their custom dictates. It is reported that the pilgrimage ended on February 15, 1972, and throughout this incident, it is believed that the Yugoslavian index case arises. There were 2 periods of the epidemic, which included a quiet first wave and a second wave that included the entire community. The epidemic was discovered on March 14th when 8 patients were admitted to the infectious disease units at hospitals in Prizren and Djavdivka, although all of them were given differing diagnosis and none were suspected of having smallpox. The infections were confirmed via electron gel microscopy at the Institute for Immunology in Belgrade. The WHO was notified of the outbreak on March 20th. 6 of the 8 patients, as well as 3 other patients later admitted to hospitals in Kosovo, were found to have been in direct contact with the Yugoslavian index case. Of the 11 patients known to have been infected directly from the index case, all had varying forms of the disease, including mild forms with minimal symptoms to the virulent hemorrhagic form. In total, there were 175 infected with smallpox throughout the epidemic, and 35 people ultimately died, bringing the overall case fatality rate to 20%. The case fatality rate was highest in children under 1 year of age at 66.7%. In patients aged 1 through 7, the case fatality rate was 20%. The case fatality rate in patients 7 through 14 was 21%. In patients aged 15 through 19, the case fatality rate was 23%. In patients older than 20, the case fatality rate was 15%. Of the 175 people, 60% had previously been vaccinated, while 37.7% were confirmed to be unvaccinated. In Kosovo, 24% of the patients were between the ages of 1 and 7. Outside Kosovo, there was only 1 child infected under the age of 8. There were no reported differences in fatality rates between male and females, as well as no specific differences in incubation period, which averaged about 11 days. Of all the cases reported, there were several different forms. The hemorrhagic form was present in 8% of cases, the flat type in 10.8% of cases, the ordinary form in 41.2%, the modified form in 38.3%, and variola without exanthema in 1.7%. Of the patients who contracted the hemorrhagic form, there was a 100% fatality rate. Among the patients who contracted the flat form, the fatality rate was 73.7%. In other forms of the disease, there was less than a 10% fatality rate. During the epidemic, 84 out of 175 cases were deemed to be nosocomial infections. So the epicurve. The epicurve in this instance was the index case occurs February 15th, while the 11 cases he came directly in contact with showed up in the second spike that you see there. The third spike is due to the nosocomial infections that arose later due to late diagnosis and lack of isolation of the first 11 patients. The index case is named IH, is a 35-year-old grain merchant who attended the pilgrimage to the Muslim holy sites in Saudi Arabia. Before his trip, he received a vaccine booster, although it did not have a valid control. Even though he had been vaccinated in his youth, they required it to be done again. While on the trip, he visited numerous shops and sanctuaries. It's believed that the index case contracted smallpox between February 3rd and February 6th and returned home to Yugoslavia on February 15th. He showed signs of fever, chills, and fatigue, but contributed these to his recent journey and did not report his symptoms. IH stated that following the days of his return home, he developed a rash on his face, but there were no scars that resulted afterwards, and all symptoms ceased after a few days. In all, IH infected 11 people directly and was deemed an unreliable historian with poor recall. The picture depicts two physicians standing with the index case for the smallpox epidemic. So for control measures, after the confirmation on March 15th, epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists went to Dubrovka to join the local health staff and stayed throughout the epidemic. There were also two physicians from Belgrade who were familiar with smallpox who stayed as well. After smallpox was confirmed, martial law was declared on March 16th, and from then on, the laboratory specimens from these patients were received by only 3 workers from the Serbian National Reference Laboratory for smallpox and the Institute of Virology, Vaccines, and Sera in Belgrade. In order to accomplish this, the government would dispatch helicopters. On March 20th, the epidemic was officially reported to the WHO. The control measures began with active surveillance and rapid identification of cases, as well as isolation of infected with mass vaccinations. Several isolation facilities were utilized on the outskirts of towns with different buildings to designate the infected from the exposed. The health surveillance consisted of daily visits to all residents within known hotspots, as well as daily temperature checks, mucous membrane checks, and evaluation for changes in skin. In non-hotspot areas, these measures were carried out every 3 days. Other control measures included restriction of movement, control of vaccination success along entry and exit routes into countries, blockades of villages, closure of borders and travel bans, as well as a ban on social gatherings. Quarantines were established for all primary contacts of the index case for 18 days following exposure, as well as antiviral administration to these individuals and revaccination. Mass vaccination of the public began on March 16th in the hotspots and expanded out in concentric circles to include municipalities where the disease had occurred. There were only 1 million vaccines on hand at the time of the epidemic beginning and limited supplies, so international aid was utilized to obtain 30 million more doses, as well as vaccine guns to quickly administer the vaccination. In 3 weeks, 18 out of 20.8 million people living in Yugoslavia had been vaccinated. The epidemic was brought under control in 6 weeks, and after a further 4 weeks of surveillance, was declared over on May 9, 1972. The social context, considering the smallpox epidemiological situation of the time, the WHO had begun the eradication of smallpox in 1967 with mandated mass vaccination to where the only areas with smallpox remaining endemic being mostly Africa, parts of South America, and Asia. With the distance to Kosovo and Yugoslavia to Africa and the other nations, the local authorities failed to keep fresh vaccines, and thus the vaccines used in the Middle East during the time were old and of poor quality. This was the first and largest outbreak of smallpox in Europe since World War II, so smallpox was not really on the forefront of everyone's mind when it came to infectious disease. In fact, the revaccination the religious pilgrims took before their trip did not contain a control, so there was no guarantee the vaccination effort had truly worked. The index case also received a vaccination certificate without proof of success, which was outside regulation at the time. This is another sign that smallpox was not a large concern, despite the sporadic cases being reported in nearby countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. Many areas that were affected by cases of smallpox did not have adequate levels of herd immunity. Only 25% of the area population was vaccinated. The lack of concern most likely led to a late diagnosis, misdiagnosis, or lack of a diagnosis until after death of the patient. There was a second case during the outbreak that was deemed a super spreader due to the repeated shuffle to different hospitals where he received multiple misdiagnoses until finally, after his death, he received the correct one. This patient was found to have infected 38 people directly, 8 of whom died. This, in combination with lack of vaccination training for personnel and a shortage of vaccine instruments led to a perfect ingredient for an outbreak. The social conditions also contributed to the outbreak in that a majority of families affected within Kosovo were usually very poor, with large families living under the same roof. It was often customary that everyone ate and drank from the same dish, as well as slept together in the same bed. The consequences to Yugoslavia's health and economic situation resulted in general collapse, severe disruption of life, economic and trade trouble instituted by border blockades, as well as misinformation being spread and panic. The total amount of money the epidemic cost the government was 6 billion dinars, or around 600 million US dollars today. In conclusion, the smallpox epidemic of 1972 brings to light many issues with the public health practices at the time. The lackadaisical treatment of infectious disease due to not viewing smallpox disease as a possibility led to delayed diagnosis, misdiagnosis, and even a total lack of diagnosis until after the patient was already deceased. Once the outbreak was detected, the government declared martial law, causing mass panic and unrest within the countries affected. This combination with all necessary measures to control the rate of the spread ultimately led to the collapse of their economy and health situation. If Yugoslavia had had adequate vaccination rates throughout the country, leading to herd immunity, as well as maintaining an adequate supply of vaccines with proper medical training for administration and effective communication strategies, the containment of the disease may have been quicker, leading to less residual fallout. Despite relatively effective means of containment, the people of Yugoslavia experienced massive violations of individual autonomy, overreach and paternalism with the declaration of martial law, and lack of justice for people across the board. In this case, smallpox has the potential to wipe out entire populations due to the high infectivity rate and the ability to live on surfaces for up to weeks at a time. One of the greatest challenges in the public health sector is maintaining the balance between preserving individual autonomy while also protecting the public and eliminating disease, and this will take all hands on deck. These are my resources. Thanks.